What's up? My name is Bill. In fighting game circles, I go by Dr. Science, and it's time to talk about
Tatsunoko versus Capcom.
You can hold yourself to the limit, be strong and jump with me. You can cry over the rainbow with me, close your eyes and just believe.
You see, I've been playing Tatsunoko vs. Capcom for over 15 years now, ever since its original arcade release, and in that time, I have done all of these things in various projects related to the game. If you go all the way back, I've been playing fighting games for around 30 years in some capacity or another, and they've been a bigger part of my life than sometimes I like to admit. Anyone who's close to me knows this, including my parents, and a couple weeks ago, as of writing this, I was talking to my dad, and he brought up that he had watched a TV show based on a fighting game. As I was racking my brain to try and think of what he could be watching, like, is he watching the Tekken anime or something? He said, you know, the one in space with the guy, Master Chief. While I really appreciated him trying to connect with my interests, I was honestly a little shocked that after all of those things I just mentioned, my own father couldn't even identify a fighting game. So I realized I had some work to do. One project that I've been considering doing for a long time now is a video guide, an in-depth mechanical reference for people who are interested in learning Tatsunoko versus Capcom. But ultimately, I decided to change the scope a little bit after this discussion with my dad. I don't think it's possible to talk about fighting games without talking about their mechanics. The primary appeal of these games is the combat, essentially a competition to see who can leverage the mechanics more effectively to achieve a win condition. And they're generally not known for their deep and engaging stories. So the soul of that video is still here, and we are going to be talking about the mechanics. However, rather than focus on getting people who are already interested in the game up to speed for competitive play, I decided I wanted to make a video that could potentially help even someone like my dad understand what this game is and why I think it's special. If we're going that route though, it's similarly impossible to understand why I love this game without understanding a little bit about fighting games as a whole first, as part of my love for this game is tied to its place in the history and culture of fighting games. So I'm gonna do my best to give some of that context too. It's not a perfect metaphor, but for the sake of this video, let's think of fighting games as a tree. A lot of the core technical and gameplay design elements that define fighting games to this day were established in Street Fighter 2, so here it's the trunk that the rest of the tree grows off of. Then there are branches splitting off to the sides, like 3D fighters, anime games, or Mortal Kombat. Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, while a relatively obscure game in and of itself, comes from a very well-loved branch of this tree, and one that you can trace back very easily and directly to the roots of fighting games. Or I guess I said the trunk? Let's not worry about it. In any event, Tatsunoko vs. Capcom is a part of the Capcom vs. series, and specifically an offshoot of the Marvel vs. Capcom series. This is true both in terms of development of the game and in its mechanics, but we'll get there. So let's start at the beginning. Street Fighter 2 was released by Capcom in 1991 and was immediately a worldwide phenomenon and a huge success for Capcom. In Matt Leone's incredible Street Fighter 2: An Oral History, Brian Duke recounts his time selling arcade cabinets of the game for Capcom USA, saying, "It just was phenomenal. It was the best thing that I've ever been associated with. I made more money that year than I ever have made in my life." I would have been almost 5 years old when the game came out, and I have fond early memories of playing Street Fighter 2 at a pizza spot in northern Wisconsin while we were visiting my grandparents' place. At the time, I had no idea that this would be the start of a lifelong hobby for me or the birth of an entire new genre. I don't think I would have even understood what that meant at the time. What I did understand is that it looked cooler, and the gameplay was just more fun than anything else around. But on top of the obvious advantages it had over those games, apparent to me even as a child, none of those games could really be taken seriously competitively in the same way Street Fighter 2 has been, nor did they attain anywhere near the level of popularity Street Fighter 2 did when it essentially launched the competitive fighting game genre. I think the concept of launching a game genre might be a little hard for some people to wrap their heads around, so real quick, let's think of it like a movie. John Carpenter's Halloween is credited with kickstarting the slasher film genre in 1978, and while subsequent slasher films have often brought their own unique ideas to the table, those new ideas also come with a hefty helping of aesthetic and structural elements that are easily traced back directly to Halloween. These are what we call genre tropes. Street Fighter 2 is Halloween in this case, and basically as soon as it dropped, other companies rushed to get in on the action. And some of it might seem a little shameless if you're not familiar with it. This is Ryu. He's the protagonist of Street Fighter 2. And this is Ryo. the protagonist of Art of Fighting, which was made by SNK and originally released in 1992, just 1 year later than Street Fighter II. You can already see how other companies leaned heavily on aesthetic elements, which are, shall we say, heavily inspired by Street Fighter, while the mechanics are more the same. So let's talk about what they are. It's arguably important to understand that Street Fighter II was originally designed to be played in the arcade, on arcade cabinets. Starting from the human side of the cabinet, Street Fighter II had 1 joystick and 6 buttons per player, 3 punches and 3 kicks, each of increasing strength. Since then, competitive fighting gameplay has mostly moved out of arcades and onto home consoles, so joysticks and arcade buttons are not the standard anymore, and the number and layout of buttons can vary depending on the game. However, most fighting games are still 2-player affairs that require 1 8-way directional input method like a joystick or a D-pad, and usually somewhere between 3 and 6 buttons per player. Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, or TVC as I'm gonna call it from here on out to save time, has 4 buttons. L, M, H for light, medium, and heavy, although they're often colloquially referred to as A, B, and C, and then a partner button, P. From a technical standpoint, Street Fighter II ran at a locked 60 frames per second, and most competitive fighting games, including TVC, still do. This means that 60 times per second, the game will check both players' inputs, simulate the action, moving forward by 1/60th of a second, then update the screen. Hitting a button while your character isn't busy doing something else will perform a move. Every move has a certain amount of time that it takes to start up, an amount of time that it is active and able to hit opponents, and an amount of time it takes to recover. This time is counted in frames. The examples I'm showing here are in slow motion, so you can see that a move with faster startup will win out if pressed at the same time as an opponent's move with slower startup. Before we talk any more about those buttons though, let's take a quick look at the screen. Starting from the top, these are the health bars. 1 for each character, and normally fighting games will make sure to have some kind of character identifier near them, like a name or a picture, as the characters can swap positions over the course of the match, but the life bars will not. The goal of a round of a fighting game is to reduce your opponent's health bar to empty before they do the same to you. In Street Fighter II, both players pick a character, and the first player to win 2 out of 3 rounds this way is the winner of the match. This is a super common system, and existed even before Street Fighter II, although this is one of the few times I get to say it's not how TVC works. In TVC, you pick 2 characters to form a team, or one of these guys. And once both of your teammates are knocked out, you lose the match. In between the health bars is the timer. If this ticks down to 0 before either player wins, the character with more health left will be declared the winner. In TVC, it's the team with the most combined health that wins at timeout. It's worth noting that fighting game seconds almost never match real life seconds. That's just how it is. The last thing I want to take a look at on the screen is down at the bottom. These are super bars. These were not present in the original arcade version of Street Fighter II, but were introduced in Super Street Fighter II Turbo, a later revision of the game that has become the primary competitive version. Since this introduction, they've become a staple of fighting games. Typically, you build up meter primarily by damaging your opponent, and once the meter is fully charged, your character can then spend the bar in order to use a powerful super move. All of the movement options that were present in Street Fighter II are still present in Tatsunoko vs. Capcom. Pressing left or right will cause your character to walk in that direction. Different characters will have different forwards and back walk speeds, with characters like Palomar having a much slower walk speed than a character like Ryu. Pressing up, up forward, or up back makes your character jump. Unlike a lot of video games where characters are able to adjust their trajectory in the air, normal jumps in most fighting games lock you into a trajectory once you jump, unless you have some kind of a special option to change it. Just like walking, jumps can be significantly different between characters, with Joe the Condor having a significantly lower and more aggressive jump arc than his teammate Ken's floaty jumps, for example. Hold down, down back, or down forward, and your character will crouch. Holding back will block incoming attacks, and down back will block low. Both Street Fighter II and TVC operate on the same high-low block system, in which there are low attacks which must be blocked crouching, mid attacks which can be blocked either standing or crouching, and overheads which must be blocked standing. In 2D games like both Street Fighter and TVC, lows generally represent the bigger threat, being faster, more common, and leading to more damage than overheads for most characters. So a typical defensive posture in traditional 2D fighting games like Street Fighter II is to hold down back to block and watch out and try to anticipate and react to overheads. One of Street Fighter II's notable mechanics is a system based on a hierarchy of moves. At the most basic level, each character has a set of normal moves, which are executed simply by pressing one of the attack buttons. Each of the buttons will give you different moves depending on if your character is standing, crouching, or jumping. With 6 attack buttons in Street Fighter II, this meant that every character had a minimum of 18 different normal moves. In TVC, there are only 3 attack buttons, which we just talked about, but that leaves us with only 9 normal moves per character in comparison. Pressing down heavy kick in Street Fighter II or down heavy in TVC will cause most characters to perform a sweep, knocking the opponent down on hit. This is very useful in Street Fighter II because you can time another move as they're standing up, known as their wake up. If you do this correctly, you can hit them before they're able to act. In TVC, knockdown characters are able to roll backwards or forwards when waking up if they want, making it more difficult to guarantee this kind of pressure. However, as a trade-off, certain moves in TVC are able to hit on the ground, or OTG as we call it in the business, allowing characters to add some extra damage after a knockdown before the opponent is able to tech roll. Some characters will also have access to what are called command normals by pressing specific buttons in conjunction with a different direction like forward mid or forward heavy. I think these command normals are ultimately probably okay to lump in with the rest of normal moves. I'm pointing them out separately here though because they're not universal between all characters, and we'll also be talking about them again later. After normal moves comes special moves. If the player executes a specific combination of inputs, typically a motion on the stick followed by a corresponding attack button, their character will perform a special move. In exchange for the additional execution requirement, special moves will typically do small amounts of damage on block called chip damage, and then also have additional benefits over normal moves such as invincibility, creating projectiles, movement, etc. The last type of attacks are super attacks, which not only require more complex inputs than specials, but will also consume your super meter when used, like we mentioned in the UI section. So at this point, you've got normal moves, special moves, and super moves. And the big reason why this is important is canceling. One of Street Fighter II's most important contributions to fighting game design and action game design in general is the concept of canceling moves that are lower on the hierarchy into ones that are higher, such as canceling a normal move into a special or a super move. This allows players to essentially combine moves to create unique pressure strings against blocking opponents or maximize the damage return from hits through combos. You see, every time you hit your opponent with a move, they enter hit stun for a number of frames depending on the move and can't act at all until that stun is finished. This includes blocking, so if you're able to hit them again before that stun ends, they can't block it. This follow-up combo is guaranteed, so basically, this doesn't actually do this much damage, it actually does this much damage. This is called a combo, and combo systems are one of the defining features of fighting games that started with Street Fighter II. One last mechanic designed to help open up defensive players is throw, with every character having a normal throw accessed by pressing forward and heavy. Throws cannot be guarded, but they can be teched by the defender if they press throw input in time. In Street Fighter II, this only prevented some of the damage, softening the throw. But in TVC, you escape without taking any damage. Some characters will have special or super command throws, which can't be teched. You can typically escape these by jumping, but depending on the setup, sometimes you just can't escape. All of these mechanics combined to create a complex and compelling gameplay experience, which felt difficult but rewarding to master on various fronts. And by understanding these foundations, many companies have put out fun and satisfying fighting games through the years. So everyone say, thank you Street Fighter II, but it doesn't stop there.
Here comes a new challenger.
After the success of Street Fighter II The World Warrior in 1991, Capcom immediately got started on what would be a long-running trend of creating version updates for their fighting games, starting with Street Fighter II Champion Edition dropping in the following year of 1992, and ultimately releasing 5 revisions of the game between 1991 and 1994. The market was also immediately flooded with imitations, as I mentioned earlier. So in 1994, Capcom already understood they couldn't simply keep reiterating their game as everyone else was also reiterating their game. So in addition to releasing Super Street Fighter II Turbo, the final revision of Street Fighter II, they also tried to push the genre forward again with 2 specific releases. First, Darkstalkers The Night Warriors was released in arcades in July of that year. Gone were the stoic karate guys of Street Fighter II, replaced with literal monsters. The graphics and animations have seen an upgrade, and the mechanics of Street Fighter II have been updated and supplemented with new systems, targeted at increasing the speed, aggressiveness, and freedom of players. Then in December of the same year, they also released X-Men, Children of the Atom. While not exactly the same, it featured a number of the same gameplay concepts first seen in Darkstalkers, but with the notable addition of the X-Men! This marked the beginning of the Marvel vs. Capcom series, as after 1994's Children of the Atom came 1995's Marvel Superheroes, 1996's X-Men vs. Street Fighter, 1997's Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, 1998's Marvel vs. Capcom, followed up by 2000's Marvel vs. Capcom 2. While you can debate the terminology and taxonomy here if you want, I think most people would just call these games the Marvel vs. Capcom series, which I'll also often just call Marvel games or versus games for short. I'll be using these terms basically interchangeably, and if you don't like that, I guess you'll just have to let me know in the comments. I loved all of these games. Once again, they felt like a gorgeous level up from the already impressive graphics of Street Fighter II, the latest revision of which came out the same year as Children of the Atom, and the gameplay is faster and more exciting as well. So fast and exciting, in fact, that I've had multiple Marvel vs. Capcom players independently tell me that they're worried the intense dopamine rushes that they felt in the Marvel games have permanently damaged their ability to enjoy other things in their lives. We're just gonna say that's a good thing and move on. My family didn't have any consoles growing up, so I couldn't always play them much, but I have strong memories of places where I could play them. I remember playing Children of the Atom in a laundromat in Milwaukee, or at Chuck E. Cheese at a birthday party, and I remember playing Marvel vs. Capcom 2 everywhere. It was at the arcade, it was at the pizza place, it was at the theater, it was at the mall. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 instantly became a beloved classic in the US and in my own mind palace. Although not as much in Japan, but that's outside the scope of this video. Not only did this game have a gigantic roster of all the coolest characters, it really did a great job of paring down the mechanics that defined the Marvel vs. Capcom series without any of the extra gimmicks that were present in some of the earlier games and then taken out. And just like Street Fighter before it, the series has inspired many imitators. To this day, there are games coming out with the same basic mechanical framework established in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, sometimes referred to as Hyper Fighters. I consider Tatsunoko vs. Capcom a part of the Marvel vs. Capcom series, and part of the reason is that it shares this mechanical lineage of the series. The other part of the reason I'll talk about in the third section of the video, but before we get there, let's talk about these mechanics that defined the Marvel vs. Capcom series. There's one mechanic in particular that I was considering adding to the previous section, but ultimately ended up putting it here, and that's dash. Tapping forward twice dashes and back twice back dashes in just about every fighting game ever, apparently starting with Art of Fighting. However, while it has been in a majority of Street Fighter games, it was not present in Street Fighter 2, which is ultimately why I left it out there. Just like walking, dashes are not the same for all characters, with a number of characteristics like distance traveled, startup speed, and momentum being different depending on the character. And in the interest of making the action faster and more exciting in the Marvel vs. Capcom series, air dashing was also added, after Capcom's first successful experiment with the mechanic in Darkstalkers. By the time the series got up to Marvel vs. Capcom 2, there were a variety of characters, some with no air dash, some with regular air dash, and some with directional air dashes, or even the ability to fly. In Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, the system is simplified, and every character has regular forward and back air dashes, except these guys. Air dashing is a primary method of approaching your opponent in the Versus series games, but especially in TVC. First, it allows you to quickly approach in a way that avoids any long-reaching low attacks. Often air dash, your character's best air normals will hit overhead much faster than from a normal jump, and they will usually connect into full combos on hits or provide you with advantage to continue pressure on block. Other movement options were also expanded upon. For example, jumping. In Marvel vs. Capcom 2, some characters have double jumps, allowing them to jump again in the air. Once again, the system is smoothed out in TVC, with every character having double jump, except these guys. And this guy. The Marvel vs. Capcom series also introduced super jumping, which is done by pressing down and then up in quick succession. This jump puts you at a much higher height than a regular jump, and unlike regular and double jumps, you are able to affect your trajectory and move your character around slightly while in super jump. In addition to these new movement mechanics, the offensive system also saw upgrades to make the game faster and more aggressive. The cancel system, which allowed you to cancel normals into specials or supers, now lets you cancel normals into specials and then into supers. In addition to that, Darkstalkers and then the Marvel vs. Capcom series introduced what's called the Magic series. Basically, this allows you to cancel lighter normals into heavier normals, with kicks, I guess, also being considered heavier than punches. Earlier Marvel vs. Capcom games and Darkstalkers had the same control layout as Street Fighter, so this meant you could cancel all the way through your normals in the order light punch, light kick, medium kick, heavy kick, then cancel into a special, and then into a super. This mechanic is pretty core to the gameplay, but did function differently depending on the game and the control scheme. For example, in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, which only had 4 attack buttons, you could press light punch twice and it'll give you light punch mid punch, or light kick twice and it'll give you light kick mid kick, in order to maintain the feel of the 6-button Magic Series gameplay. In TVC, there are only 3 attack buttons, so the game lets you cancel a standing normal into a crouching normal to compensate. This means you can go stand A, stand B, crouch B, stand C, crouch C for the same type of 6-hit string. Magic Series can also be performed in the air, with TVC allowing you to do 2 of each normal per jump before moving on. While every character in TVC can technically cancel all the way through a Magic Series, they won't always connect as a combo, so it's important to know how your character's specific normals work as a Magic Series. The Marvel vs. series also introduced launchers. These are normals that pop the opponent up into the air on hit. If you hold up, up back, or up forward while a launcher hits, your character will pursue into the air with a super jump. This means that the Versus series have a basic combo structure of Grounded Magic Series, Launcher, Aerial Magic Series, Double Jump if it's available, Aerial Magic Series again, and then either knocking down with a heavy normal or finishing the combo off with specials and supers. Speaking of supers, that was another big upgrade in the Marvel vs. Capcom series. Unlike Street Fighter 2, where you would build up a single bar of super and retain it until you used it, these games let you build multiple bars of super, indicated by a number next to the super meter. Darkstalkers again did this first, and technically let you build all the way up to 99 bars, although I'm not sure how you'd even make that happen over the course of a match based on my cursory research. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 starts at 1 and lets you build to a maximum of 5, which is the same as TVC, and it is a good number. We'll get into why before the end of this section. The Versus series lets players use this meter in a variety of ways, and in TVC every character has 2 level 1 supers and 1 level 3 super, which uses 3 bars at once. So with all these new offensive tools, we'll need some defensive tools to compensate. One significant defensive difference in the Versus series is air blocking. Unlike the Street Fighter series, where jumping generally means you are unable to defend yourself until you touch the ground, you are able to block in the air in Versus series games, including TVC. Not only does this protect you while trying to move around in the air, an important aspect of air guarding is that you don't have to block high or low while in the air. You can block high, low, or overhead attacks with any back direction. So actually, blocking in the air provides an extra layer of defense, as you don't have to worry about high-low mix-ups or grounded throws. So the paradigm that I talked about from Street Fighter 2, in which you block low and look out for highs, gets flipped on its head. Now, to avoid the rapid-fire high-lows of the Versus series, you are looking for opportunities to hold up back and block in the air, called chicken blocking. If you do this too much in block strings, though, you open up yourself to getting hit by low attacks, so it's something you have to learn when to use and when to just hold down back. Air block is a pretty common fighting game mechanic overall. By estimation, there are probably more games with air blocking than without, but mainline Street Fighter games still don't have air blocking to this day. While air blocking is common, one of the more distinctive defensive features of the Versus series is called Advancing Guard, commonly called push block. In TVC, this mechanic is activated by pressing all 3 attack buttons at once while in block stun. This will physically push the attacker back and also negate some of any chip damage taken by the blocked attack. Again, this is a super strong defensive mechanic. So strong, in fact, that it's seen very limited inclusion in other fighting games, even ones that are otherwise mechanically similar to the Versus series. But that's on purpose, to help counteract the pressure enabled by the strong new offensive mechanic. Without this in place, certain characters in Marvel vs. Capcom 2 would be able to pressure others just about indefinitely, so it was necessary to include systems like this to help keep the game fair. The last new defensive system is called Crossover Counter. A lot of people will call this Alpha Counter because of the similarity to the signature mechanic of the Street Fighter Alpha series, but in the Versus series, your partner character will tag in and perform an attack. In TVC, this is executed by pressing forward and partner while in block stun. Costs 1 bar of meter and launches the opponent into the air, allowing for a combo on hit, although the follow-up combo will be scaled and do less damage. There's some invincibility on this attack to help it go through your opponent's offense, although the efficacy of that depends on the character tagging in, as some characters' crossover counters are better than others. Potentially the most iconic innovation of the Versus series is tag mechanics. While the early games like Children of the Atom had you pick just one character, team mechanics became the standard from the start of the crossover games with X-Men vs. Street Fighter. With that game, Marvel Super Heroes vs. Street Fighter and Marvel vs. Capcom 1 all having 2v2 tag teams, and Marvel vs. Capcom 2 featuring a 3v3 tag system. I mentioned earlier in the video that TVC is a 2v2 game, but the basic mechanics are mostly the same. If the active character is defeated, there is a slight pause pause, and then the next character on the team will tag in. When you kill a character like this, you have the ability to time your attack to hit this incoming character right as they come in. Basically, a free chance to apply offense. This is called an incoming mix-up, and it's a situation in which things can quickly go from bad to worse for the defending player. The very strongest versus series characters can execute extremely ambiguous incoming mix-ups or even score completely unblockable and unavoidable hits and then convert them into the death of the incoming character. TVC isn't as bad as some of these games on that front, with only one character really being able to kill another from a single normal hit. As characters take damage, some of it is taken as permanent damage and some of it becomes red life. Red life was kind of present in Street Fighter, but only as a way for people to be able to glance up at their health bar and see how much damage they took after being hit. It doesn't really have much gameplay function there, but in the Versus series, some of it sticks around. If you tag a character with red life out, they start to slowly recover that red health. The easiest way to do this is colloquially called raw tag, although it's technically given different names in different games, and it causes your current active character to tag out and another character to tag in with an attack. The method of executing this and some of the specifics of how it works can vary from game to game. In TVC, you can tag by pressing back and the partner button at the same time when you're on the ground and not doing anything else or at neutral. The character tagging out is invincible when you do this, making it a good option for getting out of difficult situations. However, if the character tagging in has their incoming attack blocked, it can be punished with a full combo, making this a high-risk, high-reward type option. And one more thing, the character tagging in immediately loses any red life that they have left when you raw tag like this. Characters that are not currently active can also be used as assists. This is another mechanic that has worked differently in different games in the series, but in TVC, each character has one designated assist attack, and you simply press the partner button while not pressing back, and they will pop out and use it. Your assist character can get hit in this case, but that is a lot less of a threat in TVC than it was in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, as your assist character will generally pop out of combos pretty quickly. A trade-off, though, is that assists recover much slower after use in TVC, where they're ready to go basically as soon as they're off the screen in Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Assists also don't do chip damage, where they did in Marvel vs. Capcom 2. All of these changes were intended to make the game less frustrating, alleviating some of the more aggressive pressure with repeated assist calls, and also avoiding the pitfall of calling assists just to watch them die. The tag system also integrates with your super meter in a couple of ways. First off, the DHC system. DHC, or Delayed Hyper Combo, allows you to cancel a super from your point character into a super from your partner. Simply input your partner's super move and they will tag in to start it, while your point character tags out. In Marvel vs. Capcom 2, you're able to do this twice in a row in order to use your whole team. TVC only has 2 character teams, but in order to preserve this system, you are still able to DHC twice, going from your point character to your partner, and then back to the first character again. A little while ago, I said I'd explain why 5 was a good number for meters, and it's because it allows you to use your max meter by using a level 1, DHC to another level 1, and then DHC to level 3. For teams with good DHC synergy, this presents a way to spend all of your max meter in order to maximize combo damage. In addition to a damage source, this is a powerful system that can allow you to tag in safely, especially considering bringing characters in this way does not remove your red life like raw tagging. DHC is a super fun mechanic, but it's not the only special way a team can use meter, because you can also use Team Hyper Combo, or THC.
Smoke weed every day.
Unlike the sequence supers of DHC, THC sees your whole team join up to execute their supers at the same time. In TVC, you execute this by pressing partner immediately after inputting your point character's super. The partner character will perform a predetermined super alongside whatever super you did. This takes 3 meters and only performs 2 supers. Plus, most supers won't play well together and you'll typically miss some hits doing this, so it's typically not as efficient as DHC, but there are specific uses for it and it can be useful depending on your team. Some supers only become useful once used in this way. One last tag mechanic from the Versus series is called Snapback, and it allows you to spend 1 meter to force a point character to tag out and the assist character to tag in. This is powerful because it removes any red life from the character tagging in and also just gives you a lot of freedom in terms of how you approach the matchup against your opponent's team. This one bucks a bit of a trend, as it was a universal mechanic in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, which was made character specific in TVC, in which only these guys have snapbacks. And this guy. So, 9 years after Street Fighter 2 established the modern competitive fighting game, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 became a beloved classic and established the Hyper Fighter. Again, setting a framework for a subgenre that is still seeing active entries now, almost 25 years later. However, it's not all sunshine, as the period immediately following Marvel vs. Capcom 2's release, the early to mid 2000s, is sometimes referred to as the dark age of fighting games. Those of you who are paying close attention in the last history section may have thought, wow, it seems like Capcom was releasing a lot of these Versus series games in the mid to late 90s. And you would be correct. They released a Marvel game every year from 1994's Children of the Atom through 1998's Marvel vs. Capcom 1, then took off only 1 year before releasing Marvel vs. Capcom 2 in 2000. But it doesn't stop there. I already mentioned Darkstalkers releasing in the same year as Children of the Atom, and Capcom followed up on that series with the Night Warriors in 1995, a Vampire Savior in 1997, and the oft-forgotten Vampire Savior 2 update in 1999. During the same period between 1994 and 2000, Capcom also released 3 revisions of Street Fighter 3, 3 entries in the Street Fighter Alpha series, 2 entries in the Star Gladiator series, 2 entries in the Rival Schools series, Capcom vs. SNK, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Heritage for the Future, Red Earth, Cyberbots, Techromancer, Pocket Fighter, and Saturday Night Slam Masters featuring the Mayor of Earth, Mike Hagar. So it was a lot of fighting games. And that's not even taking into account other companies like SNK putting out fighting games every single year. Saying the market was oversaturated is probably an understatement, and it was very difficult for any of these games to stand out. On top of that, there were corners that had to be cut in order to maintain this type of development schedule. While MVC2 is now considered a classic and praised for its huge roster of characters and fast-paced gameplay, it's often also cited as having poor competitive balance, with only a handful of those characters being considered viable in competitive play. And while the new characters showcase some of Capcom's best sprite work to date, they can clash with other characters who have sprites reused from older games, which can lack the detailed animations of the newer sprites or just feel like they don't fit with the overall aesthetic. All of these factors combine to give the impression that Capcom wasn't really giving 110% anymore. So by the time Marvel vs. Capcom 2 came out, fighting games weren't selling as well as they used to, even if the game was loved by enthusiasts. Capcom saw this and pivoted to other genres that were performing better for them and essentially quit the fighting game business. Other fighting game makers couldn't make the switch and fared even worse. So what had been a booming genre for a decade saw no new releases from its major players for years. The competitive fighting game community, or FGC, saw this as a dark age. For me, not so much. In the year 2000, I was just entering high school, and within a couple of years, I had a part-time job and Soul Calibur 2 was coming out, which would go on to occupy many a late night with my high school friends. In 2004, I went off to college, and one of the most famous moments in competitive video game history happened. Inspired by this new idea of a competitive community of fighting game enthusiasts, I spent my college years playing Tekken 5 with my roommates, alongside some older games, and learning about the FGC on online venues like the Shoryuken.com forums. So in actuality, there were fighting games coming out during this period, and really good ones too, but not the ones the competitive communities had been based off of. No more Street Fighters, no more Marvel vs. Capcom. But that all changed in 2008. At this time, Capcom still wasn't quite ready to dive back in headfirst, but they started contracting some external devs to help create some new fighting games. The first of these new games was Street Fighter 4, which launched in July of 2008 in the arcades with development support from Dimps. It was once again a massive success, and is often credited with single-handedly revitalizing the fighting game genre and the competitive scene around it. But that wasn't what I was most interested in. As I said before, I had a deep love for the Versus series, which went back to my childhood, and learning about the competitive community around Marvel vs. Capcom 2 online only strengthened that feeling. And there was one more fighting game announced for later that year: Tatsunoko vs. Capcom Cross-Generation of Heroes. Based on early trailers, it was clearly basing its gameplay off the Marvel vs. Capcom series, but with characters from Tatsunoko Productions properties. It didn't generate huge buzz in the USA because of the relatively unknown characters and the fact that it was only slated for release in Japan. However, I was planning to move to Japan after college, and I had been keeping a close eye on the game online. I loved the new cel-shaded art style, which was shared with a lot of my favorite games at the time. I loved the retro Sentai-type aesthetic of the characters, and I loved the fact that it represented an evolution of the Marvel vs. Capcom series. So when I got to play Tatsunoko vs. Capcom in the arcades in Japan, the birthplace of the fighting game, it felt like I had come full circle. In an interview with Gama Sutra, producer Ryota Nitsuma said that Tatsunoko initially approached Capcom about making a game using their characters, and then later Capcom decided internally that the Versus series fighting mechanics would be a good match. So with that, we take all the old Street Fighter 2 mechanics, add the Marvel vs. Capcom 2 mechanics on top, and add a few new twists, which we will talk about right now. Alright, it's finally time to talk about these guys. I mentioned earlier that TVC had moved to 2 character teams, down from the 3 of Marvel vs. Capcom 2. But instead of picking 2 characters, you have the option to instead pick one giant character. And they really are giant. So large, in fact, that the camera had to zoom out in order to fit them. And they still cover part of the health bars. There's one giant representing each company in the game, with the titular Robot Coom Lighter from the TV series Gold Lightan representing Tatsunoko, and PTX-40A, aka from Lost Planet representing Capcom. These two have much higher health than even the healthiest of regular characters. They aren't susceptible to normal throws, and they have hyper armor, meaning if they get hit, they don't go into hit stun like normal characters, so their attacks aren't interrupted when taking damage. These benefits are offset by some downsides though, as the giant characters can't super jump, they can't double jump, they can't air dash, and because they don't get a partner, that also means no assists, no tagging, which means no recovering red life, no crossover counter, no DHCs, and no THCs. Generally in fighting games, the more unique a character is, the more options it has different from the rest of the cast, the harder it is to keep it balanced for competitive play. So this immediately seems like a red flag. Playing against these characters requires a completely different set of tactics from a regular match, so balancing them for the dev team is almost like balancing another completely separate game on the side of balancing the regular game. As a result of this different gameplay style, these characters have been controversial, but given just how unique they are, I think they're remarkably well balanced. No giant player has ever really dominated competitive TVC at the highest level, and yet giant players are able to beat even experienced players picking good characters for the matchups if they play well. Not with this guy though. Sorry Gold Light fans. Moving on from the giants though, one TVC mechanic that was introduced for the normal characters was variable air rate, or VAR. While in the air, executing a quarter circle forward with the partner button will make your character execute a predetermined move. If this move hits or is blocked, 1 meter is spent and your partner character tags in. Unlike in a raw tag, you keep your red life and your character is immediately able to act when tagging in, meaning they're not punishable on block, which makes this a useful technique for getting a character tagged in safely. But its main use is for combos. Higher combo damage scaling and the ability to build back some of the meter you spent on the tag makes this a powerful tool for adding damage to combos with a lower meter commitment than just using a super. TVC also has a defensive mechanic that wasn't present in Marvel vs. Capcom 2. It's called Mega Crash, but more colloquially it's called a burst. A burst mechanic in a fighting game allows your character to physically burst out of hit stun or block stun, giving you a chance to avoid high amounts of damage in games with long combos by bursting out early, or stopping a character from dying to a combo that would have killed them otherwise. Be careful though, because these can be baited and punished. Typically these take some kind of resource to execute, like in Guilty Gear, the progenitor of the burst mechanic, where there's a separate meter for burst which regenerates over time after use. In TVC, Mega Crash requires 2 meters to activate and also does an amount of non-lethal damage to yourself, meaning you can't burst yourself to death. If a burster would have killed you, you'll be left with no visible health and any chip damage will kill that character. Probably the most famous original mechanic of TVC is called Baroque. If your character currently has any red life, pressing an attack and the partner button at the same time will cancel an attack that's currently in progress, returning your character to neutral so they can do whatever they want. We've already gone over how important canceling is, but this can do a huge variety of things, like allowing you to cancel specials to start your combo string over, or even turn a disadvantageous situation into an advantageous one. You can't Baroque cancel supers, but even with that in mind, the limit of its application is essentially just your imagination. On top of that, it provides bonus damage to any follow-up combos afterwards. As a trade-off, it will decrease the meter you gain from hits while under Baroque, although it also decreases the meter your opponent gains from being hit, so you can use it to prevent them from gaining burst. The amount of extra damage depends on the amount of red life you use, leading to some truly hilarious moments. But the meter gain change is constant, even with a minor amount of red life. And on top of that, our community has found a bug that allows just about every character in the game to make their normal attacks unblockable in specific situations by using Baroque. Going into the details would take longer than I want to spend in this video, but if you're interested, I've got another video going into it and I'll put the link in the description. And that's it! So you take the strong fighting game foundations established in Street Fighter 2, add in the Hyper Fighter mechanics found in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and add in some originals, plus some brand new characters and a fresh coat of paint, and you have TVC. But is it better? All right, we're going without a script for this section. At the end of the last section, I asked, is it better? Is Tatsunoko vs. Capcom better than Marvel vs. Capcom 2 or the other versus games that came before it? It's kind of a subjective question, but in my opinion, yes. Why? Probably because it's the first game that I learned competitively.
the game that taught me to play fighting games, so a lot of the things just feel correct and natural about it. I don't feel like I'm the only one who feels this way. But if I was going to give something more objective, it would be this. The music is great. I love how eclectic it is. You've got everything from like Marvel 2 style jazzy music in Las Vegas, all the way to like rock music in Wasteland and Burning Wasteland. You've got techno over in Orbital Ring. And then you've got weird vocal themes like Roll's theme, or even the weird cut rap track, which I'll pause for here.
I'm sure you can't touch this skill. Like hammer on the head is where I hit the nail.
Like I said, I love the art. I think the cel-shaded aesthetic not only is really emblematic of the sort of creative era that game came out of, but also it aged like so much better, I think, than other fighting games that came out at the same time and had like a more realistic aesthetic. Like, sorry, King of Fighters Maximum Impact, I love you, but you look like shit. And of course, the gameplay. Some people who maybe play Marvel 2 or something more and aren't used to TVC as much can often say things like it feels too defensive and too slow. The character power is a little bit lower in TVC than the Marvel games, so you lack the ability to like convert from super jumps efficiently. You lack the ability to high-low people with like 8-way air dashes as much as you can. So the gameplay is already a little bit slower there, and then burst on top of that makes it feel really like defensive to a lot of people. For me, I feel like that's great. It's nice getting to play a little bit more neutral most of the time than you do in like Marvel games. And Baroque is really, I think, like the crown jewel there that saves it, because as long as you have any red life, any block string that you get in, you have basically limitless potential to just unblockable your opponent or get mix-ups in or just be super creative and make that one chance you have really count if you're smart with it. And it's not just Baroque, like all of the new mechanics feel so good and so interconnected because they embody this design philosophy that the Marvel series has and kind of takes it to extreme. You don't have any new gauges or extra systems or one-time modes or anything like that. All the new mechanics are tied in directly to your health and your meter, your two sort of core fighting game design elements. And because of that, they necessarily and naturally interact with each other in interesting ways. So like, for example, if you're getting hit, you have to burst, which wastes your meter, but then it gives you an extra amount of red life, which you could then potentially use for a comeback. However, your opponent could burst that if you're not careful to make sure you deplete their burst first. The red life can also stop your opponent from getting meter for burst in time if you're smart and quick with using it. So again, I think because of that design philosophy and the way these things are baked into just making the core aspects of fighting games more interesting and more flexible, they naturally interact in really cool ways. And learning to leverage that is like a really cool and intuitive thing that I am still working on now, and I think it's awesome. I love it. So with that said, did Tatsunoko versus Capcom become the next big fighting game? Well, no, not really. Capcom said openly that it met their sales expectations, which I have to assume weren't very high due to kind of the weird licenses and things like that. But ultimately, Tatsunoko versus Capcom didn't really have the competitive legs that other versus series games did. The one true litmus test for a fighting game's competitive popularity is it at EVO? EVO, or Evolution, is the biggest fighting game tournament of the year, and being announced in its lineup of 8 or 9 games means you're one of the premier fighting games, and it's kind of a badge of honor that lets people know that this is a fighting game that it is worth their time to practice. Tatsunoko versus Capcom was only ever at EVO for 1 year in 2010, and then never again. So why was that? Why wasn't it more popular? Well, it wasn't more popular for, I think, 2 big reasons. Number one is that it was on the Wii. At this point, most serious fighting game players had already bought an Xbox 360 and a joystick to play Street Fighter 4 with. So nobody wanted to shill out an extra however many $100 to get a Wii and a joystick just so they could play some fighting game with characters they'd never heard of on the system that their grandma plays Wii Fit on. So It didn't do great there. And also, there's an elephant in the room that I've been avoiding talking about, which is Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Tatsunoko vs. Capcom was basically a beta test for Marvel vs. Capcom 3. As we talked about before, the original Tatsunoko vs. Capcom came out in 2008, and then later it had a revision upgrade in 2010. Now, in that same year that it came out, they announced Marvel vs. Capcom 3, which was being produced by the exact same team as Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, and clearly they were taking the lessons that they learned on TVC and applying them to this more sort of visible license in Marvel vs. Capcom 3. So even at EVO 2010, the 1 year that Tatsunoko vs. Capcom was at EVO, there were demo booths in the back of the hall for Marvel vs. Capcom 3 before it came out. And at the Tatsunoko vs. Capcom pool stations, that's all anyone wanted to talk about was, have you played Marvel 3? Have you played Marvel 3? By the time the game was at EVO, it was already like people wanted to move on. So at EVO, Marn ended up winning over K-Beast, and then I remember one of the Cannon brothers, the founders of EVO, took the house mic and said, wow, I don't think I've ever seen anyone play that game before, and he probably never would. Once Marvel vs. Capcom 3 came out, it essentially immediately replaced Tatsunoko vs. Capcom in the competitive community, and TVC was mostly forgotten, but not by all of us. I've been playing it the whole time. Starting in 2011, I was helping out running side tournaments, and ever since then, I've been running it in bedrooms and basements and side tournament areas, bring your own console spaces. And I feel very fortunate that I have a community of people who's been there alongside me to explore this game. The people I met at EVO 2010 are now some of my oldest and best friends, and I am just super thankful for that community. The TVC community, and more broadly the niche fighting games community, has been a place where I feel like I have been able to be authentically myself in ways that I don't always get to do. And one of my dearest hopes in continuing to run the game is that I can provide those kind of spaces for other people. So to the community, to everyone who plays Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, watches it, or just came to watch this video, I love you, I appreciate you, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye.
Even though it's my personal favorite, I don't need TVC to be the largest game in the world. I just hope that those of us who still love this game can help keep it from being forgotten, and maybe even help a broader group at least understand why it's important to us. That means you, Dad. This is not a fighting game character! Actually, never mind.